We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe wherever you download your podcasts as well. Today we are joined once again by Christian Toto. He is the author of a new article in Real Clear Investigation. It's called "So This Conservative Comic Goes on Social Media," and he's also the editor of HollywoodInToto.com. Christian, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Can you walk us through this investigation that you did for Real Clear? Because it's really fascinating. A lot of people might think, Real Clear Investigations is, full of these political investigations, but you just did one on kind of the plight of conservative comics on social media. So if you could just walk us through what you found, that would be fantastic.
Sure. This actually started on my own website. I noted a few different comics. One was on the right. One is apolitical, but sort of really does make fun of woke culture, and noticed that they were being stymied in some way. One particular big tech company would take them down. They'd have some issues with another big tech company. So I noted it, and then I thought it needs more investigation. I want to dig deeper into the situation. And, I think we're dealing with an imperfect storm of, big tech is sort of flattening the voices of people on the right. It's unavoidable to say anything else at this point. It's very obvious. But I just thought it was interesting that in a comedy world where so much of what we see and hear is left of center, what about the people on the right? What are they saying? What are the jokes that they're sharing? And it turns out sometimes there are people that don't want those jokes to be shared. It's fascinating. And just to backpedal real quickly, I really do think it unofficially began with Tina Fey. When she performed as Sarah Palin in Saturday Night Live, I think it was a sensation. Listen, it was a great impression. It was funny. It kind of caught the zeitgeist. And I think it really did damage to Sarah Palin as a candidate, as a political persona. And I think that comedians really took note of that moment and said, hey, wait a minute, what we do can have an impact. It isn't just a joke. It isn't just a laugh. And I think that the comedy world changed after that. And I think now what we're seeing is sort of these big tech platforms saying, well, we don't know if we want these jokes to go out in the public because they could get traction.
Can you tell us about this community of conservative comedians and the world that you sort of bring people into in the article? Who are these people and what are they up to? Are they using social media as their main platform for their comedy? And what kind of jokes are they telling from sort of that right of center vantage point?
Well, I think if you're a comedian and you're right of center, where are you going to go? I mean, Saturday Night Live is not going to hire you as a writer. You're not going to be a part of Stephen Colbert's team. So you're a little bit adrift. And I think what a lot of these comedians are doing is they're finding another home online, YouTube, podcasts, social media like Twitter and Parler and things like that. So they can get their voices out there. They can say what they want to say. And often they can just say what they want, period, where, they don't have to follow certain rules. And that's where the whole big tech suppression comes in, which is so fascinating. So I think that's what's happening now. And as far as the kinds of jokes, I think if you look at the landscape of a culture today, there is so much information, there is so much material that you can make fun of as far as woke culture, identity politics. So a lot of these comedians are leaning into that. The one particular fellow who kind of caught my eye first is Ryan Long. He's a Canadian. He came to New York City a year or two ago. And, I've spoken to him. He is aggressively apolitical. He's not picking a side. He'll poke fun at the left or the right, but he just sees so much information about woke culture that he can make fun of. And his real ethos as a comedian, from the best I can tell, talking to him and listening to his podcast and his video clips, if all the comedians are going in this direction, he doesn't want to be that guy. He wants to go in the different direction. And this is one way to do it.
It's interesting because you were talking earlier about how you have all of these left-wing comedians, and over the course of the Trump administration, we saw an explosion of anti-Trump political comedy, like you mentioned Stephen Colbert, and that seems to me to be a function of how we're really splintering into these niches. So Stephen Colbert can support his act because he doesn't have to pull in Johnny Carson ratings. He can be the number one host in late night while also being this sort of like boomer resistance comedian. Now, the flip side of that that coin is that some of these conservative or right of center or anti-woke comedians, like Ryan Long is a great example, are able to boost their careers by, cornering the market, that underserved sort of like appetite for anti-woke comedy. Do you think they're also finding that to be true? So that even though there may be these barriers erected by big tech and others, that they are finding audiences?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there's a hunger for a comic like Ryan Long, and I keep going back to him because he's such a perfect example. Where if no one is telling these jokes, and he's doing it, and not only doing it but doing it very well. He's a very sharp, interesting fellow. He really kind of nails what are the true issues that we have going on, beneath the surface, not just sort of the basic yuck yuck. I'm woke. I'm not funny. So yeah, and you make a great point. In the old marketplace, Johnny Carson had to appeal to left and right because they needed that ratings base. Now, a Colbert can basically say, I don't want a single Republican viewer watching me. And he could not only survive, but he can thrive. So, that should pave the way for 3 or 4 late night shows that are right of center, or maybe even just libertarian based, or maybe even just balanced. But we're not seeing that because the powers that be in Hollywood don't want that. And they know that that might make a lot of money, and they're willing to leave that money on the table because they want their message out. It's fascinating, really. The whole, it's show business. Well, there's an asterisk there.
That's a really interesting way to put it. And you talked to another great example of this, which is the Babylon Bee, which is kind of also doing what The Onion does, probably doing it better than The Onion does it these days. But it's satire, often of the left. Their satire of the right can also be absolutely hilarious. But they do sort of illustrate that not in the sort of like stand-up comedian sense, but in the publication sense, the satirical publication. What did they tell you, and why did you want to make sure that you talked to the folks at the Babylon Bee?
I mean, they're a great example of what's going on. I think you can point to a aggressively right of center artist and you could have that conversation. But when you have something like the Bee, which is so funny and so sharp and so clever, but this isn't a new thing for the Bee. This whole new woke era that we're living in right now, they've been fighting with Facebook and fact checkers for a couple of years now. So they'll put out a story that is hilarious and obviously nonsense and obviously fake, and they'll get dinged for it. I mean, Snopes will come a calling, other websites will come a calling, CNN, some of their anchors will say, well, this is trying to trick and deceive. No, it's funny. And sometimes satire can kind of bite so deeply that there is a level of deception there because they're getting at a bigger truth. But that's not the Babylon Bee's fault. That's the fault of reality, really. And listen, if you go to the website, it's very obvious what's going on there. There's not like hard news, and all of a sudden you're faced with satire. So the fact that The Onion has existed for all these years, and it used to do a really good job. I read it now. It's a little embarrassing, honestly, how behind the curve they are as far as the political movement. But the Bee does a great job. So the fact that they're getting this pressure, Facebook comes along and they say, well, our fact checkers say you're kind of not really being truthful in your presentation. You're trying to deceive people. We may need to deplatform you. We may need to kind of reduce the amount of sharing we have in your stories. That's a big deal. If the Babylon Bee stories get shared aggressively on social media, if that gets shut down, they may go out of business. So they're facing an existential threat with these different platforms. It's a big deal.
So the article, which again people can find on realclearinvestigations.com, also introduces an element that I think is so essential and interesting to think about in all of this, and that would be Jon Stewart. You mentioned the infamous moment when he allegedly took down Crossfire, which I guess he really did take down Crossfire in retrospect, rightfully or wrongfully is the debate. But thinking about Tina Fey as Sarah Palin, it's interesting because that was also really at the height of Stewart's popularity and Stewart's power. How do you think Jon Stewart factors into this entire conversation?
Well, I don't think it's fair to pick on Stewart in that he was doing humor with satire, with the news in a way that maybe people weren't doing as aggressively as he kind of did it. He did it very well. He's a smart, funny guy. But it wasn't my original thought, but it might have been John Nolte of Breitbart, sort of the clown nose off, clown nose on. When he's trying to make a point, the clown nose comes off, but if you call him on it, then the clown nose goes, I'm just a comedian, hey, leave me alone. And there's some truth behind that too. He is just a comedian. He's not the PBS NewsHour. So I think what he kind of helped introduce is this sort of quasi news, very kind of tricky editing to kind of sell a political perspective. And again, no one did it better than Jon Stewart. So that's what we're seeing today. And just another point that kind of jumped in my head. A couple of years ago, when President Obama was in the White House, Saturday Night Live mostly kind of, we're not going to really poke fun at him, but they did a couple of times, and they inspired fact checks from, I think it was both the USA Today and the Washington Post. Now, how many Alec Baldwin fact checks did we see over the last 4 years with Trump and Saturday Night Live? I don't think there were any in the mainstream media. But once the sort of the conservative leaning comedy enters the fray, the powers that be get uncomfortable, and they realize that this is something that's it could have an impact. So that's where we are today, really.
How are the conservative comedians that you profiled and you spoke to responding to this in their act? How is it shaping the way that I shouldn't say shaping the way, how is it shaping the content of their comedy?
I think Orion Long is defiant. I think he sees this and he kind of it eggs him on. Nick DiPaolo, a very funny stand-up comedian who's sort of openly conservative. He's talked about using different platforms to get his podcast across. His podcast was doing well on YouTube, then YouTube kind of circled in, flattened it down a bit. So now he's on Rumble, he's on other websites. But YouTube is huge. It's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And if you're not on YouTube, you're not going to get the reach that you might have otherwise, for the most part. There are exceptions, obviously. So I think, every comedian has to do it differently. I spoke to Michael Loftus, a very funny guy. He's a veteran comic. He's a writer. He's done sitcom work. And, he's trying to play by the rules. And, it's not always easy and it doesn't always work, but that's kind of part of his approach. But I think what we're seeing throughout these different comedians is the lack of transparency is massive here. So a comedian doesn't even know where the line is, what's wrong, what's right. And what that does, and it's brilliant in its brutality, is that they self-censor. They say, well, I'm not going to tell that joke because that's nearish the line. I think the line is here. It gets close. I'm not going to go near there because I want to be on there. Listen, I'm an entrepreneur. I have my own website. If I'm off of Facebook or Twitter, then I'm in trouble. I can't spread my work out. So if you're a comedian, especially now with the pandemic, and you're shut down from different platforms, you're in trouble. You may not make a living because you need all these different tech companies to kind of get your message out there and also to earn some revenue. So it's really unfortunate.
Let me pull at that thread a little bit. How has the pandemic impacted them if they are now sort of shut out from clubs and the like and live performances and the in-person stuff that used to be probably the bulk of their income in many cases? Is it fueling their sort of use of these platforms? You just mentioned now that it's exacerbating the problems with them, but are they sort of building their acts to fit the platforms? How are they balancing that, knowing that they have these in-person options shut down, but B, they are going to need to rely on some of these platforms that could sort of at any given moment shut them down?
I mean, they don't have a plan B when the stage is shuttered. What do you do? So I think a lot of them have gone to podcasting, and I think at this point, I cross my fingers as I say it, I don't think that podcasters have been really kind of hit hard by what's going on. I think Tim Dillon is a great example. I mentioned him in my story. He really in the last year has kind of amplified his comic message through podcasting, through comedy clips he puts on YouTube and other places. So I think this was a way to kind of say, hey, I can write and be funny and do it online and see if I can get an audience that way. So, I think once the pandemic lifts, some of these contingency plans will continue. Maybe, comedians will put out content and maybe sell it through their websites or sell it to different platforms. So, I think the cagey entrepreneurs in the comedy world are taking advantage of it. But again, at what point? Ryan Long had a video that was poking fun at news stories that were kind of, isolating white people and kind of singling them out. Instagram blocked it and TikTok blocked it. And they didn't really say why. And there was nothing crazy about that particular clip, but that was something that they found culturally inappropriate. But they're not going to say that, of course. So now he's out on those platforms. So at least, he has to worry about what they'll do, what they'll share, what they won't share.
So that's incredibly confusing. And I've heard you mention that problem a couple of times just in our conversation already. It's that they're not even being told what violated the content standards.
Mm,
So they just have to sort of guess at what it is in order to continue monetizing the platform.
yeah. It's one of the biggest flaws in all these big tech companies is their community guidelines. Listen, I cover Hollywood all the time. I see celebrities saying the worst things, the
Mm-hmm.
absolute worst things. And to me, I'm kind of a free speech guy. Let it go. I mean, that way I can say, oh, I'm not going to follow Bette Midler anymore because she's saying these awful things. But what Bette Midler says on your average Thursday is likely much worse than what Gina Carano said on about the Holocaust comparison, and she's fired. Bette
Right.
Midler is working on Hocus Pocus 2 right now with Disney Plus. She's not going to face a lick of blowback or any sort of punishment for what she says. So there's the double standards are just off the charts, and a lot of it is because of the lack of transparency. You get banned, you get thrown in Facebook jail. Well, why? What specifically what did I do that was so bad? And what we've seen in recent weeks with all the, Parler needs to be shut down because it's fomenting violence. Have you seen Twitter? I mean, my golly, it is an absolute cesspool, and there are people pushing for violence all the time. Why are we not shutting down Twitter? It's ridiculous.
What's interesting to me is that a lot of these platforms, at least for a while, really made a conscious effort to have good relationships with conservatives who were using their platforms because they were making money off those
Mm-hmm.
conservatives who were using those platforms, and they would be in communication with them. And I think to the disappointment of a lot of people on the left, and it seems as though that disappointment may have really shut down those channels and destroyed those relationships. Is that your experience in talking to these comedians, that they really aren't getting any answers from Facebook, from Instagram, well, Facebook/Instagram and YouTube, when their content is blocked or they're suspended or whatever it is, they are not in sort of productive dialogues with the platforms at all?
Yeah, well, Michael Loftus said he's trying to get answers from Facebook. He's seen his reach, Facebook reach, really kind of shrink dramatically. You can't get a hold of them. Personally, I think I've reached out to Facebook a couple of times. It's not easy. Listen, they're a massive company. There are so many clients and so many users. I get where it's difficult, but at the same time, that's your job. If you want to kind of have a connection with the audience and try to be a company that serves them and that does great customer service, you've got to kind of up your game. I'm sure there's a couple of nickels they can kind of rub together and get that going and say, hey, we need more help here. Let's get more people to help out our customers. So it's very frustrating. And Ryan Long, when I speak to him, he really doesn't want to be that guy. He doesn't want to be like, oh, they hate conservatives. But he's like, what other conclusion can you draw? But that. And he said, I just wish there was more transparency. I wish I could figure out what's going on. Nick DiPaolo's manager I spoke to, he said, in the past, we had a pretty good relationship with YouTube. They ding us, we'd reach out to them, there'd be some sort of discussion, and then things would get resolved in a fairly efficient manner. And he said that was great. At least it's a back and forth, it's a dialogue, it's a conversation. There's two sides. He said in recent months that's kind of gone away. That conversation doesn't happen anymore. So what are you to do?
I think that's really a crucial point because, again, there used to be this symbiotic relationship where they're making money off of each other, so they sort of had to get along. It was best for everyone. Facebook in particular, they have the resources
Mm-hmm.
to reach out to conservatives. They have people, whose jobs it is. But I imagine people in those positions who had prior relationships with conservative websites or comedians or whomever it was, it seems like almost over the summer, as everything sort of ratcheted up to an even higher level, those relationships, got less worth their time, became less worth their time to cultivate because
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, they're just going to shut you down no matter what.
Yeah, well, and it's the way the culture is moving. I think it was about 2 years ago. I'm a little fuzzy on the time. Joe Rogan invited Jack Dorsey on his show, and I think it didn't go well. Or I think a lot of Rogan's fans said, "Boy, those are a lot of softballs you threw at Dorsey. His platform is really not treating people fairly." So they brought Dorsey back. They brought a colleague of his back, and then they invited Tim Pool, this sort of irreverent, iconoclastic journalist, to ask some really tough questions. It was mesmerizing, and I give Dorsey and his colleague credit for being on the show, talking about it, being open to the criticism, and they seemed like they were genuinely ready to listen. they're not listening anymore. They clearly don't care. I mean, that was either honest on their part then, or it was a charade then, and it is now. But the culture has dramatically changed, and they feel no interest in it. And ultimately, if every conservative left Twitter tomorrow, they would listen. But every conservative is not off Twitter right now, so they don't seem like they have to listen.
Because when they try to go somewhere else, like Parler, Amazon Web Services or whoever is hosting it will pull the platform from their own platform.
Mhm.
Now, how do you think Andrew Schultz gets away with it? Because Schultz is somebody who the market really responded to, and that means he sort of skyrocketed on YouTube over the course of the pandemic, and then got a Netflix deal out of his success on YouTube. So here you have two big tech platforms really sort of boosting his success and making money off of his success. But Ryan Long is sort of similar in content. Like they talk about similar things. I mean, Schultz is maybe more focused on the daily politics of everything. But how is he getting away with it? Why is Netflix rewarding Schultz? You have a big tech company like Netflix or YouTube. Why do they let him get away with it? Is it just another example of how unevenly their standards are applied?
Yeah, listen, kudos to Netflix for inviting him onto their platform, and I guess kudos to other platforms for not kicking him off yet. It may happen. We shall see. It's also possible that maybe if they don't perceive him as a cultural threat yet, that it's okay. They can be magnanimous and say, okay, well, Netflix will have, you on have a show for you, and see what happens. But one interesting thing is when his show on Netflix debuted, there were some journalists who were attacking the show for being, it might have been that they mentioned like maybe he called it the Chinese flu, something maybe akin to that. I don't remember the specific examples, but there were definitely journalists out there willing to kind of spark the cancel culture brigade. It didn't happen, but you never know what it will take to happen. Last year, a single screenwriter said that Gone with the Wind should go away because of how it, doesn't really depict the horrors of slavery. HBO Max pulled it within like a week, and then it did come back, and there's a warning label on it. But you never know what's going to trigger these kind of cancellations. It could be just one disgruntled person. It literally could be. So we've seen examples where a very, very tiny minority, their voices are heard and respected. So you never know. Andrew Schultz could be singing a song today, and he could be out of work tomorrow, and from Netflix perspective.
So I want to ask, since you cover the industry on your site, hollywoodandtoto.com, why is the industry so responsive to those, lone complaints? I think it was floated in the LA Times about Gone with the Wind. Why are they so immediately responsive to, I guess we'll call them woke complaints? Because it does seem as though they'll sort of jump to address any of those problems, no matter how ridiculous. They're prepared, and they will, suddenly pour all of their resources into righting whatever the perceived wrong is. Why are they so responsive?
The short answer is I don't know. The larger answer is everyone is responsive. A corporation is going to go woke in a heartbeat and going to apologize if 6 people are offended by a certain new commercial spot. It's just the way our culture works right now. We sort of overemphasize Twitter. Twitter is not real life, but people act like it's real life. I was fortunate enough to be on the Adam Carolla show recently, and he was kind of going off on a segue or a rant, and he called Hollywood cowards, and I can't say he's wrong. I got into this whole business because I love movies, and I just wanted to be a movie critic, and I've kind of evolved over time, and I'm exhausted by the Hollywood community. I'm angry at them. Why don't they take a stand? How hard is it for a gaggle of our biggest stars to stand up and say, "Listen, I don't want my conservative comic friends to be canceled and to have their reach, limited. We need to have free speech." Where's George Clooney talking about Dr. Seuss, Meryl Streep? These are the biggest stars who talk about every issue, and they can't spare a syllable about free speech and about cancel culture. They're all scared. They're all thinking of themselves. They're all hoping, oh, I hope it doesn't come to me next. But it's going to come to them next. And sooner or later, maybe one of their movies will be canceled. And all of a sudden, we can't enjoy it. We can't see it anymore. If you look at the culture, you look at pop culture last 50 years, there's so much stuff that could be canceled. I think the social justice mob is just like licking their chops, thinking, okay, I'm going after this tomorrow, and next week I've got this movie. I mean, it's everywhere. I've been watching Family Guy with my kid, and I shouldn't watch it because it's sometimes inappropriate for a little guy. And there's Seth MacFarlane could be gone tomorrow. If the cancel culture mob really wanted to come for him, there are so many jokes on that show, making fun of people for being overweight, making fun of Jewish people. I mean, it goes on and on and on. It's the show's stock and trade. Is he living on borrowed time? Maybe if Seth MacFarlane comes out and says, you know what, I don't believe Dr. Seuss should be canceled, then they'll circle back. When J.K. Rowling was beloved by the left, but then when she kind of defied the trans groupthink, they came around and they went after her and tried to cancel her over and again. So I think a lot of these artists know if they just step one toe off the line, they're next.
That's okay. So that gets at another question I wanted to ask you as somebody who covers the industry, is that we often think about these things in terms of the market, right? So if there is this underserved population of conservatives who want a show like Last Man Standing, for instance, which got canceled and then got picked up, and the market seemed to work because they said, listen, there's a big audience for this show that's not overtly liberal and does sort of have a sympathetic depiction of conservatives. Why is it that we never saw another version of Roseanne, minus the legitimately problematic elements of Roseanne? Why is it that we didn't see a bunch of those crop up after, for instance, Roseanne did so well in the ratings immediately? Why is Hollywood not responding to the demand for anti-woke or just non-woke art?
Because it's show business with an asterisk. It really is. I mean, if it's funny, whenever there's a new late night show that comes out, it could be with a person of color, it could be a new fresh face, it could be someone we've seen for decades, and he or she has a new show. They always say it's bold and it's brave and it's new and it's fresh. No, it's just the same. It's a different person with a different background telling the same kind of jokes. If Hollywood really wanted to reach out to the marketplace and say, let's put Dennis Miller, give him a late night show, and he's going to cover it from the right. They just don't want to do that. They'd rather not make that money. It sounds weird to say, but look at Fox News. Why is Fox News so successful for the last 20, 30 years? Because most outlets lean to the left, or aggressively so. So they had one that leaned to the right, and it's a sensation. They don't want to duplicate that. It seems like a no-brainer.
So thinking about the consequences of this, it's important to think about how it's actually sort of affecting the art itself. And the Golden Globes, I thought, were a good example of this. I'm thinking back 2 years ago, I believe it was Andy Samberg and Sandra Oh who hosted the Globes then. And I think it was after the Oscars So White year. And it was just, their act was just so neutered. It was so milquetoast, so vanilla. There's just nothing funny. And I remember thinking at the time, this is the future of Hollywood, in that the humor is just going to be completely vanilla. It's going to be this sort of impression of humor without any of the punch. I saw something similar to that in this year's Golden Globes, partially because they were juxtaposed with the 2020 Golden Globes featuring Ricky Gervais, who just skewered all of them to their faces, and for very good reason, and I think to very good effect. How did you watch the Golden Globes? Did you see them in that context? And then are there other do you have concerns that this really is neutering the art itself?
It absolutely is. A couple thoughts. One, I had the exact same reaction that you did to the Andy Samberg and Sandra Oh monologue. Here's the thing, making the audience laugh is not their goal anymore. It's not on their priority list. Hey, listen, if they accidentally make a chuckle, and then all well and good. It's not why they do these shows. And it's one of the reasons, many reasons, why these shows are cratering in the ratings. They're not fun. They're not enjoyable. It's a lecture. It's scolding. It's a combination of we need to do better versus look how good we are, which is a weird combination of platitudes to share. But yeah, look at it this way. When was the last great big screen comedy? I know we had pandemic kind of shut things down, but The Hangover, Bridesmaids, Wedding Crashers, they don't make them anymore. They can't make them anymore. They're off. I mean, and the director of Joker, who did Hangover, did I think Road Trip and some other films, his name is escaping me, but he came out and said, listen, I'm not doing comedy anymore. It's just not the climate for it. I'd rather do something like Joker, which is dark and disturbing and interesting and a very good film. How telling is that? The comedy is just is handcuffed. When you watch a Seth Meyers or a Stephen Colbert, they're not really trying to make you laugh. They're trying to send a message. They may try to make it kind of couch it in a funny phrase, but it's not hilarious. I mean, when was the last time like people shared a joke on from late night TV that was just really funny? When was the last big screen, big laugh comedy that Hollywood has produced? I don't know. It's not the goal.
So what's the, if I'm playing devil's advocate, because I have a lot of thoughts on this myself, obviously, but what is the loss to our culture? So what is the big deal if people can't watch hangovers, or if there are no future hangovers or no future
Mhm.
bridesmaids? What is really the ultimate loss?
Well, I think from a comedy perspective, comedy, we life is hard. We all have hardships. It's nice to laugh, but on the bigger picture, they're kind of narrowing the stories that can be told. The perspectives shared, the angles, the themes. They're narrowing the kind of characters that we can see on screen. So, sort of a raging id like John Belushi in Animal House is now, you can't do that in a movie, even though he was not a saint. He wasn't there to be a role model for students. He was there to make us laugh and to be outrageous. So I just think from a creative perspective, you sit down your laptop, you want to write a funny story, you want to write any kind of story. You've got to think about what's going to go on. You've got to think about what you're limited from saying. You got to think about which groups you're allowed to share and talk about. Director Craig Brewer, who did Hustle and Flow, he did Black Snake Moan, he did Dolomite Is My Name. He just directed the new Coming to America, which is very weak, and I don't recommend it. But there was an article in IndieWire, an interview with him, and they were kind of asking him, you're white. Why are you directing films with predominantly black casts? Well, A, why not? Well, I mean, he's a terrific director. He can do good stuff. And is that where we want to go? Where if I'm white, I can't tell a story with black actors or Asian actors or Hispanic. It just, I mean, it just seems so restricting. And also, wouldn't it work in reverse if you were a black director? Could you tell a white person's story? You haven't lived in their shoes, but we don't talk about that. It just, I mean, I can't believe where we are in our culture. If you're a storyteller, you tell a story about the human condition. And if you're telling a story about maybe black characters, you do your research, you talk to your actors, you get feedback, and maybe there are cultural tells that you weren't aware of that maybe the actor is aware of. Maybe he or she can kind of have a conversation. And I guarantee the director would be more than willing to embrace them and add them into the story. But it just seems like such a terrible place to be creatively. And I think we've had such a wonderful rush of creative stories, mostly on the small screen. I fear that's going to dry up soon. I mean, I think the need to kind of propagandize is going to start to kind of consume the great stories. That may be where we are in 10 years. I don't know.
What films stand out to you from the last few years? Because I totally agree that there has been a stifling that has really affected Hollywood's output. I think Nomadland is a beautiful film and a beautiful, I guess, brave film that allowed for representation of the white working class in a very fair way. But are
Mhm.
there other films that kind of stand out to you where they were brave and Hollywood really got something right from the last, let's say, 3 years?
Nothing really jumps to mind. I've seen great TV shows for sure. I just wrapped watching Ray Donovan, which was as unbelievably entertaining as any show I've seen. So it's nothing really comes to. I did enjoy Nomadland, and I agree. And by the way, that director is an Asian woman whose
Yes.
previous film was called The Rider, about this Bronco buster kind of fellow who had a serious head injury and had to kind of reclaim his life and kind of figure out where he's going now. That wasn't her culture, but she got invested in it. She did the research and she told this beautiful story. Do we want to stop her from telling that story? I mean, it's very frustrating to me that that's where we are. Again, I just wish actors would speak out and say, listen, we want to tell our stories. You can critique our stories, that's fine, but we want to have the ability to share them. And also, Hollywood has done a bad job of letting people of color into their community to give them a full opportunity. And I think part of what we're seeing now is sort of a collective guilt. If you look back in recent studies about the number of female directors in Hollywood, it's embarrassingly small. So I think there is cultural progress going on amidst all this craziness where we think, okay, yeah, I mean, Jordan Peele is a supremely gifted director. Now he's making horror movies that are excellent. We want that. We want everyone to have their say and have their voice and to be able to kind of speak their mind and not be shut down in the ways that maybe old Hollywood did. So those are good things that are happening in the industry, but it's overwhelmed by other movements that are going to be really negative.
Yeah, and you mentioned Todd Phillips, the Joker director. It's funny because he did do Joker, and then he took a ton of flack for Joker from the left and from film critics who complained that it was, sympathetic to the demographic that he was profiling, which they sort of see as a Trumpy demographic. And so it's like, what is the incentive to tell anybody's story? Period. And I wonder if you hear, I mean, one thing that I've heard rumblings of is that when you have these sort of like the supply for, say, for instance, female directors is low. And so it's like part of the problem is just increasing the supply. And right now, when you're sort of throwing all of these women into writers' rooms, or all of these people who are trying to really essentially fill quotas, they're actually just having a hard time creating good work because they now have these pools to work with that are not necessarily the most qualified and are being forced on them. Do you hear from people in the industry who sort of reach out to you privately? Maybe they're even too scared to do that, but say, I wish I could speak out. I wish I could tell you what's really happening here. I wish I could be honest about the dangers of stifling free expression. Do you hear from people who have those ideas and complaints, but only can express them privately?
Well, I literally had a phone call with someone maybe 10 to 15 minutes before we started talking. I was an actor, a name you would know, and he complained to me kind of gently, but sharing that he thinks he's been sort of blacklisted for appearing to be right of center. So that doesn't exactly fit what you're asking me, but that's sort of an example of what's going on behind the
Totally.
scenes.
Yeah.
And so I would never out him. And I just wanted to kind of share that perspective. But I imagine there are many, many people behind the scenes who are very worried about what's going on. But again, it's a fear thing. But you know what? If a number of people spoke out, if a number of powerful people kind of joined together and said this is wrong, then I think sort of this would shake up the culture a bit. When Jerry Seinfeld said maybe 4 or 5 years ago, "I don't do colleges anymore," in his inimitable voice, it shook people up. That was one comedian, but it was because it was him and like a beloved comedian. And it was because it was a guy who we know is clean as a whistle with his comedy. If it was outrageous, if he was too outrageous for colleges, that meant something. So I think there could be cultural moments where it just takes one voice to really stand up. But we need more. We need many more. And Hollywood is just not heeding the call.
I remember when there were lists released. I can't remember if they were awards season picks or if they were 2020 retrospective best of, but I remember it was like a Hollywood Reporter list and a list in the Wrap or Variety or something about the top picks of movies essentially from the last year. I remember publisher Ben Domenech and I were looking at the lists and we were like, what the hell are these movies? Like we've never heard of half of them, because essentially your critics now are picking these like indie films that nobody's heard of because, for a variety of reasons. But if you had to sort of what would your best picture nominees, of the films that are eligible this year, what would they be?
I wrote up a top five list, I think, maybe top 5 or 10 recently, and it was the most bizarre list I've ever assembled. And a couple of reasons. One, I've had some sort of health issues in my family that kind of restricted me from watching as many movies as I usually do. But Nomadland was my top three. But I didn't find many good movies this year. The ones I saw, they didn't impress me. A lot of the sort of Oscar bait movies just didn't wow me. I think it's almost a separate issue where what movies are being Oscar nominated. That sort of Hollywood has lost a populist feel.
Yep.
It used to be Lord of the Rings. It used to be films that made maybe 100, $200 million of the traditional box office. And I think we've been kind of moving away from that for quite some time. So I think that the critical community, and I'm part of it, I'm a film critic, is getting kind of narrower. I think, I think we're not really thinking about sort of mainstream entertainment as being worthy. It's why it kind of was a big deal when Black Panther won a Best Picture nomination. And there were a lot of different reasons for it, but everybody saw it, everybody loved it. It was a good movie, and I kind of applaud those things. But I do think we're kind of, there's a real disconnect there. You look at Rotten Tomatoes, it'll have like, 98% fresh, and then the audience is like 22%. So it's kind of a separate cultural issue. Maybe it's tied into what we're talking about right now, but that's another factor too. I mean, the ratings for the Oscars this year, if you until the Golden Globes crashed, I think it's going to be it's going to make that look like a blip on the radar.
Yeah, I agree with that. Do you think do you think there is sort of a silver lining here and that the future could be Gina Carano going to, Bonfire Legend? Is there going to be, do you have hope that increasingly these landing pads for heterodox actors and actresses, people who just have ideas as, radical as not agreeing with the far cultural left on every single point of their dogma, do you think those landing pads are becoming a more plausible infrastructure? Do you have hope that with the sort of splintering of media, that those niches where people, maybe the vast majority of consumers who want anti-woke comedy or want anti-woke art in general or just non-woke art in general, do you have hope that there will be people who meet that demand and kind of revitalize the entire scene?
I think I have hope that there are enough people with power on the right who are going to start funding these efforts. And I'm a contributor to the Daily Wire, so I just want to put that up front. But I'd say this with or without that, kudos to the Daily Wire for getting into this space. I think there are people on the right who finally realize that there's a cultural issue. It's not just putting out enough white papers about a specific issue. So I think the hunger is there. I think they're starting to build the infrastructure. But having said that, if our culture moves in the direction it's currently moving, where a parlor is silenced within a matter of days by multiple big tech companies throttling it literally almost to death, because it did come back shockingly, then I think there is no hope. I really don't. I mean, if we're going to go in that direction, then what chance? I mean, what if Daily Wire is hosted by a certain company and they kind of decide to shut them down, or maybe the app that Daily Wire has, maybe that's no longer available on these different platforms. I mean, we've seen a quick glimpse of what can happen in worst case scenario. And what's so frustrating and so maddening to me is that the media, for the most part, the mainstream media reporters are all on board, all on board. And it shocks me to my core that that's the state of affairs, that there are not more journalists who are just outraged by beyond compare about this. If someone used the wrong pronoun on a personality, I think you'd see more outrage about that particular moment than we are seeing right now about the free speech fight and the kind of the sides who are waging a war against it. I'm just shocked by that. I'm just shocked. A year or two ago, when that No Safe Spaces movie came out, I remember seeing the critics and they were just savaging it. And it wasn't that the cinematography was bad or that it was slow or that it didn't make its arguments. They hated the whole idea behind it. The fact that conservatives were saying we need more free speech, not less, that maybe we shouldn't ban people on campus from speaking. They didn't like that. These are film critics. This supposed to be about freedom. I'm just stunned by it. I recently reached out to 5 different film groups, and they were dedicated to sort of empowering women in film and TV. I said, "What do you think about Gina Carano being fired? What's your reaction?" They didn't answer me. They don't care.
Of
She's a
course.
liberal, they care, but she seems right of center. They don't care. They don't care that her voice is silenced. That her empowerment to stand her ground caused her to lose the best job of her life. They don't care.
Hmm. So I think there actually is genuinely, there has been for years a problem where conservative art, to speak broadly, is kind of terrible, right? Like conservative films or conservative documentaries or whatever it is, country music actually has probably the best, mainstream country music is probably the best conservative art that has existed, when it talks about family and, country and all of that stuff. But that's mainstream. When conservatives sort of overtly set out to create their own art, it doesn't always turn out that well. And I think partially the problem is, again, supply, that a lot of conservatives don't pursue careers in artistic industries. But with things like what happened to Gina Carano continuing to happen, do you have hope that there will be more people, more talented people who know how to produce work on the level of, acting in The Mandalorian, or, popular films? Do you have hope that there will be more talent in this space in the future?
I do. I think that that talent already exists within the industry, but they're very afraid to say, "Oh, I'm a right of center guy or gal." So I think there's that pool of people who just maybe need the freedom to say, "I am who I am, and I want to do the work I want to do." I think that's part of it. I think we need more resources. There should be maybe even a school dedicated to right of center art, perhaps, or just training people. We talked about how there weren't enough women directors. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the three A-list directors started a $20 million fund to train young women to become directors? I couldn't have been happier if that happened. That'd be wonderful. It's a good thing. Train people to tell their stories. Maybe people on the right need to kind of make that happen as well. A lot of this is about resources, and it's up to conservatives to really support the art. And I think we've done a poor job of that often. A year or two ago, the Clint Eastwood movie about the Richard Jewell
Yes.
had, I mean, it was beautifully presented, great acting, a compelling story based on true stuff, and it bombed at the theater. That was a movie that really trashed the FBI for kind of not doing the right thing, and really trashed the media for just torturing this poor fellow, which would be like, catnip to a conservative. And we didn't go see it. Now, maybe it was the messaging. Maybe Warner Brothers should have reached out to right of center radio stations and said, "Hey, you got to talk about this movie. The themes are really integral to what you're talking about." But I think too often, we need to make the blockbuster. We need to make the Passion of the Christ. The Passion of the Christ made so much money. It forced Hollywood to start making faith-based movies, again, on a smaller scale. But Sony has a division that's surrounded by faith-based entertainment. I think they're more accepted now than they once were. I think some mainstream studios have kind of dabbled in that arena. But it took that grab you by the scruff of the neck success to change things. And I think the conservatives need to make that happen again.
That's excellent insight. I want to close by asking, as the vaccine sort of rollout continues and more people are getting it, we saw New York City's theaters reopen, or maybe it was all of New York State recently. Obviously, the theater industry is bloated and was bloated before the pandemic. What do you think the future of theaters is? Do you think it's, you have those big box office films like Black Panther playing at the megaplexes and indie films playing at theater/restaurants that are more experience based? What does it look like from your perspective?
I think generally it's grim. I think what we're seeing now with HBO Max, where the movies come out in theaters and at home at the same time, we've seen other major studios shrink their theatrical window, meaning if it comes out on this month, it may come out on home video next month instead of 2 or 3 months. I think we've spent an entire year getting accustomed to watching brand new releases with big stars at home. I think the theatrical model is in serious trouble. And, at the beginning of the pandemic, I thought things will be fine. Once the pandemic ends, people will come back. I don't see that happening anymore. I think there are different models in play. I think a main voice at Disney recently said we're not going to go back. I don't. That's not the way it happens. They're not going to change things back to where it once was. I'm very pessimistic about the future of theaters as they once were. They may continue to exist. Maybe they'll exist just for the Black Widows of the world, those big popcorn movies. I think things have changed, and I don't think they're going back.
And finally, how will that change the scripts and sort of the aesthetics of movies going forward?
I don't know. The thing I'm weakest on is sort of the financial side of things. If Can you make a Black Widow style movie with that big budget and have it be as successful at the home video experience, like video on demand, as theaters? I don't know that. So I do think it will change. I'm not really sure. I'm really not sure. Do we want to see the kinds of movies in theaters that we want to see at home? You know, when Black Widow comes out, it'll be better in a theater. It'll be louder. It'll be bolder. The screen will be bigger. You'll have people around you. If that starts to fade, do we want that same experience at home, or do we need, or are our artistic hungers different for the home viewing experience? I don't know. I really don't. It's kind of out of my pay grade. I think I can't really go there. And I also think that anyone who really knows the future right now is full of it, because I think nothing is certain at this point. I think everything is changing, and I think culture generally is changing much quicker than it ever has in my lifetime. So I feel like what seemed impossible yesterday seems very real tomorrow.
I like that point because it's interesting to look at like the Scorseses of the world who came up at a time when came of age at a time when there weren't really even DVDs or VHSs, and the movies were meant to be consumed in the theater experience. And that changed, 30 plus years ago at this point. And so the way most people consume movies now is at home, and you now have a new generation adapting to that. But as you say, things are changing so quickly that it's impossible to predict how people will adapt and react.
Yeah, my kids would rather watch a cartoon, a show, a movie on their little tablet. I've got a 65-inch screen TV in my movie room, which I'm in right now. They're not as interested in that. Daddy likes it, they don't.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, Christian, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to Christian Toto. He is the editor of HollywoodandToto.com, also the author of the article that we were discussing, which you can read on realclearinvestigations.com. This has been another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. We will be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.